Hey everyone, today we're looking at the strongest every killer has been in Dead by Daylight's history. Trapper kicks us off with a rather crazy start. He was strongest all the way back on launch in 2016, when he was able to set traps directly underneath the hooks. And yes, they worked too. The big issue here was at this point you couldn't save from hooks from any direction, but instead only the front of the hook. This meant you had to go through the trap. Traps could also be set much closer to one another, and patch notes even mention they could overlap at times. The traps also took longer to disarm and could be placed onto the hatch. He was also very good as back then Survivor was quite heavily favoured with many strong loops and actual infinites. Being able to trap them therefore was clearly a benefit. Wraith has had a few solid states, but it could be debated he's at his best now, with him no longer having the light burn mechanic, a mechanic which meant he could be stunned out of his cloak if a flashlight was shone on him for 2 seconds. This was only removed fairly recently in April of 2023. Since then he's not really been touched much. The other time could be after patch 4.5.0 or February 2021 when he received a slew of buffs, with this also being prior to his nerfs to his post uncloak speed boost and uncloak movement speed. Billy, there's going to be some debate, but I do think his strongest was post his overdrive rework in January 2024. He got a buff to his chainsaw's movement speed, hit cooldown, miss cooldown, a decrease to collision, and of course the overdrive itself, which replaced the awful overheat. He also got a number of new add-ons to refresh his kit, most of which were a notable improvement. The other debatable time of course would be before his overheat rework, back upon release up to July 2020. He was considered one of the best killers and was almost entirely unchanged for about 4 years, with the chainsaw back then having no overheat or overdrive at all, and simply being usable whenever with no special effect. Nurse is a character who has been the strongest killer in the game since she came out in August of 2016, literally number 1 for over 8 years now. However, I would say when she really hit her stride and still had a bunch of busted add-ons that allowed up to 5 blinks was after patch 1.9.0 in January 2018. Prior to this, Nurse could not curve her attacks post-blink, adjust her blink distance by how long it was charged, and couldn't blink through floors or ceilings. This patch changed all of that, making her essentially unstoppable from this point on. This was also before the 3.3.1 patch, which gave her a proper power cooldown, where before all her blinks could be used as soon as fatigue was over. She also had a reduction of her max blinks down to just the current 3, so in between was sort of the sweet spot. Myers, a bit like Trapper, had a bunch of downsides on release in October 2016, but also a lot of busted things too that could be debated as his strongest state. Upon release, Myers could actually stalk multiple survivors at the same time, progressing Evil Within incredibly quickly. He further had many of the same busted add-ons he has now, such as the Tombstone piece and Full Tombstone, slightly better at that point. But then he also brought along the perk Save the Best for Last, which allows you to recover missed attacks 20% faster, and landed attacks 33% faster. It had no tokens back then, it just did these things at base. You could further pair it with the then recently reworked Unrelenting, which would give you a 30% reduction to missed attacks and 22% reduction to landed attacks. This meant you had an over 50% reduction to missed and landed attack cooldowns, letting you recover insanely quickly. There was also a big issue back then with the new obsession mechanic, basically encouraging you to tunnel out the obsession for rewards. Old Dying Light, also released with Myers, was a good example of this. Hag has taken a long fall recently and over the past few years, where she was once considered a solid A tier character and even up into S in some cases. She was strongest between her buff fall in 2.1.0 all the way up to the release of boons and the healing metas of 2021 onwards. So September 2018 onwards to October 2021. She's really not been changed all too much. Her power has largely been reliant on her surrounding circumstances. The only major nerf she's had recently directly to her is of course her counter mechanic where traps can be scratched out. If I had to pinpoint her strongest point, I would say somewhere during mid to late 2020. Doctor was strongest back when he had the very busted ability to shock people and read auras with use of a nurse's cooling. with Snap Out of It counting as a healing mechanic and therefore allowing you to near permanently keep survivors in Madness 3. June 2018 onwards to December 2018, he was very powerful. He did have clunky aspects back then, but I think solely for this build and its potential with other healing focused perks, it meant he was quite strong for a stretch of time. Huntress was strongest back in a similar time to Maya's, for a similar reason, incredibly quick recovery times. Back in July 2017, Huntress was able to throw hatchets at an incredibly quick rate, with her 2 add-ons Flower Babushka and Mana Grass Braid, which then paired with the Old Tinkerer, a perk that originally sped up power recovery times, she could basically rapid fire hatchets, non-stop. Bubba I think was honestly strongest from fairly recently, up until around the time Anti-Camp got implemented in October 2023. He's one of the strongest campers after all, so this did nerf him. He also received a nerf to his effect on the endurance status in this patch too, basically from his rework in 4.1.0 up until the current day. I would be more inclined to just say before the anti-camp rework though, as there was less of a DS presence then. Considering playing him normally, his strongest state is probably just his current self. He recently got a number of nice buffs to his kit and add-ons. Freddy's strongest state was of course his Forever Freddy days, a time fairly soon after his rework when he had a number of very busted add-ons that slowed repair and heal speed when in the dream world, and also a little when out of it too. If you paired up swing chains and jump rope, you'd apply a 21% reduction to these speeds and 3% to those who were awake. You could then pair this up with Old Thanatophobia, Sloppy Butcher, Hex Ruin, and just basically any perk that caused considerable slowdown. The first ever tier list I made, I put Freddy at number 1 at the time, because he was so strong and so incredibly easy to use. Pig I'm going with her January 2019 post-buff iteration before she was hit with all of her nerf walls. I think this is likely when she was the strongest, when she'd had some nice changes but no nerfs just yet, and even a couple buffs. Her add-ons I believe back then were also pretty decent, there I would say before much of the current day's craziness too I suppose. Clown was strongest post his new rework in February 2021, when he received a slew of buffs alongside his yellow bottles. Back then he also had the Redhead's Pinky Finger in its strongest state, where it would not reduce your bottle numbers. This was also pre-nerf Ruin and Sloppy Butcher, which were both great for Clown. Old Pinky Finger though was notably oppressive and could level him up a few tiers. Spirit used to be incredibly busted with her ability to phase and leave almost no clue as to where she was. This was back around November 2018. This was the time when she had been recently buffed, with her becoming a lot more stealthy and difficult to counter. She further had collision when phasing, allowing her to find survivors far more easily. And she also could not be seen when vaulting, she just appeared on the other side when she did. She then also had some really busted add-ons, like her old Prayer Beats bracelet, which removed all sounds when she was phasing, allowing her phasing to be completely silent, and therefore undetectable if she was phasing at all. You got gen grabbed a lot against this. There was also the old Mother-Daughter ring, which provided an extra whopping 40% movement speed to her phase at the cost of no longer seeing scratch marks. Legion was strongest back when they had a particularly devious strategy in December 2018 to January 2019. During this time with Frank's mixtape and stab wound study, you'd be able to repeatedly hit survivors with Feral Frenzy and slowly whittle down their deep wound timers, whilst constantly pressuring them by running backwards in chase or losing chase and coming right back. It meant they had to basically watch as their deep wound timers slowly killed them. Plague I'm going with October 2021, and partly down to the surrounding times with Boone's Circle of Healing at its peak, and Plague receiving a buff wall around the same time. Healing and healing perks were incredibly strong and oppressive, and Plague is known of course as a character able to basically make all healing useless with her infection ability. Ruin was still usable at this point, along with Pop Goes the Weasel and Plague's perk, Corrupt Intervention, allowing her to be very strong despite the times. Ghostface has had some rough times with his reveal mechanic often being quite inconsistent or just straight up bad. I would say over the years he's been steadily buffed though, and he's probably best just currently. He has a much better power now after his rework, and he's had a number of buffs and reductions over the past year or so as well. Demogorgon has not really changed all too much since launch. I guess we could say its strongest state was relatively recently with the overpowered build usable with Lifeguard Whistle, Thrill of the Hunt, and Devour Hope, which allowed Demogorgon to almost guarantee a fully developed Devour Hope Hex Totem, with old Lifeguard Whistle providing a near live monitoring of the totem and its progress. This was so powerful it led to Lifeguard Whistle getting reworked reworked completely. Oni was strongest back in December 2019, and more specifically his PTB, where he was able to complete much more impressive flicks than he can now. He also had some stronger versions of his current add-ons, with a key one being the old scalped top knot, which allowed him to start his demon dash much faster. You'd get a bit more blood back then, and his power could fully recharge passively too. Deathslinger was best back when he could almost instantly aim down sights. That's no exaggeration either, he could aim down sights incredibly quickly, and he also had a much smaller terror radius, which allowed him to almost be a stealth killer with how he could get close and approach survivors. It used to be just 24 meters. His add-ons used to be relatively decent too, where after his rework they were just awful. Pyramid Head's strongest state was definitely prior to his changes to Punishment of the Damned, back when he could cancel his ranged attack with nearly no delay, making any window or pallet vault near impossible for a survivor to win. You could simply hold the power and cancel at the very last second, if need be, when now there's a small animation. He's not been changed all too much since then, so I think his 4.0.0 release was simply his strongest too. He also had the ability to camp cages back then, as they wouldn't relocate. He was also notably stronger around this time, as he could tunnel with little to no consequence, and this is back in the days of Decisive Strike being genuinely oppressive. Blight's strongest state was shortly after his release, once he'd had a few adjustments to his kit, such as the ability to destroy pallets with lethal rush, and his POV had been corrected after being strangely low. He was particularly good with his own perk Hex Undying, when it was paired with the still very powerful Hex Ruin. Back then he also still had all of his super busted add-ons, such as Old Blighted Crow and Rad, and Alchemist's Ring. He was quick, had insane regression, and could instantly recharge tokens pretty much. Twins have had a wild ride, but their strongest time was definitely during their rework PTB in April of 2024. This rework was a long time coming for them, after having so many issues and clunky aspects, but the changes made were very overtuned. Victor became an absolute monster. He would now injure healthy survivors instead of latching onto them, he couldn't be kicked after landing a pounce, he'd return much sooner, and could be recalled whenever and almost instantly, and a bunch of other insane cooldown reductions. It was too much, and that whole PTB was utter chaos. Trickster became incredibly powerful in a PTB during November 2023. In this PTB he got a number of sizable buffs, such as an increase to his base movement, making him ranged, but also a 4.6 movement speed character, no recoil at all for his knives, faster throw speed, and an incredibly fast main event. With the add-on Death Throws compilation, you had to barely reload at all, and could continually use main event. This alongside Fizz Spin Soda allowed you to reduce the laceration meter even more. He was very strong during the PTB, but after was nerfed down by quite a bit, but still keeping some of the changes, leaving him quite average. Nemesis has always been just very average, to be honest, with no moment that I'd say he was overpowered or very strong even. I would probably just go with his most recent state up till the current day. He's got some nice buffs and changes recently, and he's in a good spot. Pinhead was best on release when he could be a lot more oppressive with the box, with it actually shooting chains at survivors even if they were in the middle of solving it. It was kind of unfair, honestly. Back then he also had the original Engineer's Fang, which had no downsides, and add-ons that caused a greater reduction to chain hunt start times, such as Pillar. This was September 2021. Artist's strongest state had to have been her PTB state. While she remained mostly the same since then, one key difference was that stationary crows would actually damage you too. This meant you could almost trap loops by placing a crow down and almost guarantee damage on every loop. It forced survivors to stay and maybe get insta-downed, or go to the next tile and hope for the best. She of course changed the meta up a bit at the time too, with the introduction of Hex Pentimento and Pain Resonance. Sadako has had a number of insane states over the years and changed multiple times. Her strongest state though was probably when she could simply repeatedly teleport and against most teams almost guarantee to condemn survivors quickly. This was July 2023, I believe, and allowed Sadako to be incredibly oppressive, forcing you pretty much to hold a tape, but also causing high levels of condemned if you got hit with one too. It was very infuriating to face, especially with some of the eerie add-ons like Eerie Tape. Dredge, I would say, has always been incredibly average, but it is being made slightly better, especially as of 8.2.0 in August 2024. It got a number of nice buffs and it's probably the strongest we've seen Dredge. Wesker was best prior to his infection nerf in 8.0.1 8.0.0. Back then he had a much higher infection penalty for full infection of -8% move speed, and you kept 50% infection after being unhooked, which was really rough and depressive. Sometime after his quality of life updates up till that change, I think was likely his strongest. He's never really been weak particularly, and he's been consistently strong. Knight, I would have to say his post 8.2.0 August 2024 rework, where he received a bunch of great updates, allowing him to select his guard of choice, and I think in general having a better system for using them. He was sort of okay for much of the time before this, but it really made him more viable, taking away lots of the randomness he suffered from before. Skull Merchant was strongest back during the 3-gen meta, unsurprisingly when she could hold generators insanely well, with her power originally rewarding hard camping and 3-genning. Her drones made it very difficult to break the 3-gen, with them speeding her up, exposing survivors and giving her constant information on survivors' whereabouts. This added to the ability to repeatedly kick and regress generators without consequence, meant she was an absolute menace up until April 2023. Singularity hit his stride after being terrible in his PTB, like awful, to being pretty decent, to being kind of good, and where now he's actually quite strong post his 8.1.0 rework, or buff wall. He got a bunch of nice quality of life stuff, add-on reworks, and power smoothing. He's just really solid after them all, I think, so current. Xenomorph has almost been completely unchanged since release, aside one nerf in 7.2.2, so pre-nerf release 7.2.0 August 2023 Xeno was marginally better, and so it was strongest then, I'd say. Chucky got a fairly sizable nerf recently, and prior was very strong. I think his strongest was either post-patch 8.0.0 in June 2024, or just before it potentially, depending on your preference for the scamper mechanic. Unknown, I would simply say its current version. It's not been changed much, aside a few changes a little while ago, so current, it's been pretty strong since launch. Vecna's strongest state is a bit tough, but I reckon just his release date in June 2024. He did have a few small downsides he no longer has, but he also had some much more busted ability values, like a very quick pallet lift on his Mage Hand spell. His Dispelling Sphere spell was also a little stronger. Dracula we can pinpoint to his post-release buffs in 8.2.2, where he received a number of buffs to his bat form, but also his switch cooldown, which helped him greatly. He hasn't been altered too much, but I do think he was stronger in this period prior to the nerfs he got in 8.4.0. Houndmaster, you may think it would be tough for her to already have a stronger state than her other ones, with her only being out for a little over a month, but she does. Post-release in 8.4.2, she received a number of buffs, including a reduction to her chase command, a reduction to her cooldowns, faster dog movement, and a lot more. She's sort of busted at the moment, able to send out Snug even when she's not fully charged her power bar. It will likely be altered in January 2025. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.